They sent 50,000 men into the jungle with one order burned into their minds: find him or die trying. This was not a rumor, not propaganda, not an exaggeration whispered by soldiers around campfires. It was an official decision by the Imperial Japanese Command. An entire army mobilized to hunt one American who refused to disappear. For 3 years, aircraft scanned the canopy. Patrols bled through rivers. Villages were erased from maps. Yet the man they hunted did not run like prey. He vanished like a myth. And while the enemy searched for a ghost, he was building something that should have been impossible. A hidden army of 35,000 men, right under their noses. History usually tells us wars are won by generals, divisions, and grand strategies. But sometimes history breaks its own rules. Sometimes a single man rewrites the logic of power. This is not a story about survival alone. This is a story about defiance, about how fear can be turned into fuel, how isolation can become strength, and how one man, hunted, surrounded, and declared already dead, created a force so dangerous that even the enemy refused to believe it existed. When the war reached the Pacific jungles, the Americans expected resistance. What they didn't expect was betrayal by terrain itself. The jungle was not just green, and it was alive. It swallowed sound. It erased footprints. It devoured entire units without firing a single bullet. Japanese forces understood this terrain better than anyone. They had turned it into a weapon. And yet, somewhere inside that living nightmare, an American officer was doing the unthinkable, turning the jungle into his shield, his factory, and his recruiting ground. At first, his name meant nothing to the Japanese command. Just another enemy officer missing in action. Another body the jungle would eventually claim. But weeks passed. Then months. Patrols began disappearing. Supply convoys were ambushed and stripped clean. Not chaotically, but with discipline. Villagers whispered about a foreigner who spoke with authority, who promised protection instead of punishment. A man who didn't conquer, he organized. The Japanese dismissed these reports as superstition. Jungle madness. Soldiers seeing things they wanted to fear. But then came the intercepted messages. Coordinated attacks. Signals that indicated training, not desperation. This wasn't a lone survivor anymore. This was something else, something growing. The man knew one truth that most soldiers never learn. You don't need weapons to start an army, you need belief. He understood that the people trapped between empires, farmers, hunters, fishermen, were not loyal to flags. They were loyal to survival. And survival in a war of annihilation required choosing the side that treated them as humans rather than expendable tools. While Japanese forces ruled through terror, executions, and starvation, this American offered something radical: structure, respect, and a future. Slowly, quietly, the jungle changed sides. Men came at night, one by one at first, then in groups. They brought machetes, old rifles, sometimes nothing at all. He trained them without firing shots. He taught them movement, silence, patience. He turned hunters into scouts, farmers into logisticians, villages into intelligence networks. No flags, no uniforms, no ranks visible to the enemy. What he built didn't look like an army, and that's why it survived. When Japanese patrols intensified, the American adapted. He learned to think like the jungle. Camps were temporary. Fires were cold. Paths were erased. Messages traveled faster than bullets. Every Japanese move triggered a response before it even reached paper. The enemy thought they were chasing a man. In reality, they were provoking a system. By the second year, Japanese commanders were furious. 50,000 troops were no longer searching. They were bleeding. Morale collapsed. Soldiers feared shadows. Officers executed their own men for cowardice. Entire units refused to enter certain valleys. And still, the American remained unseen. No confirmed photograph. No body. No final engagement. Just losses. Endless, humiliating losses. What terrified the Japanese most was not the ambushes. It was the realization that the jungle was no longer neutral. Villages went silent when troops approached. Guides led patrols into dead ends. Information was always late or false. The American had done the one thing no invading force can survive. He had won the people. By the time Japanese intelligence finally understood the scale of the threat, it was already too late. This was no longer about one man. This was about 35,000 trained, disciplined, invisible fighters, operating without formal supply lines, without central headquarters, without fear. An army that did not need to win battles. It only needed to outlast. And that was the most dangerous kind of enemy. The jungle had learned his rhythm, and now it moved when he moved. Japanese patrols marched in formation, boots heavy, rifles ready, maps clenched in sweating hands. Yet every step they took felt as if the ground itself was watching them. They believed they were hunting a man, but what they were truly facing was an idea that could not be surrounded, an enemy that did not sleep in camps or announce itself with gunfire. By the time a patrol realized it had crossed into hostile territory, it was already too late. Because hostility no longer wore a uniform, it lived in the silence before the ambush and the emptiness after it. He structured his force without ever calling it an army. Each village became a cell, each cell knowing only what it needed to know. No single capture could expose the whole. Orders passed through memory, not paper. Signals were woven into ordinary life. A fishing net hung the wrong way, smoke rising at an unusual hour, a path deliberately blocked by a fallen tree. To Japanese officers trained in conventional warfare, this was madness. There was no headquarters to bomb, no commander to assassinate, no decisive battle to force. Every victory dissolved into foliage, and every defeat multiplied into resistance. Training was relentless but quiet. Recruits learned to move for hours without breaking a branch, to read disturbed insects as signs of approaching soldiers, to navigate by sound and shadow rather than landmarks. Weapons were captured, repaired, and redistributed. Ammunition was counted like gold. Nothing was wasted. When rifles were scarce, fighters learned to kill silently and disappear, leaving behind confusion rather than corpses. Fear became a tool, carefully sharpened and precisely applied. Japanese countermeasures escalated. Entire regions were declared hostile. Villages suspected of cooperation were burned. Elders executed in public. Families marched away as warnings. The intent was clear: cut the American off from his lifeline. But terror backfired. Each atrocity multiplied his ranks. Men who had lost everything no longer feared death. They feared submission more. The jungle filled with volunteers who did not need persuasion, only direction. As numbers grew, discipline became the true test. He enforced rules with absolute consistency. No looting, no revenge killings. Civilians were protected at all costs. Anyone who violated these principles was removed immediately. The force was not built on hatred. It was built on control. That control is what separated his fighters from mobs and transformed them into something far more dangerous. Population in arms that trusted its leadership. Japanese intelligence reports began contradicting each other. Some claimed the American commanded thousands. Others insisted he was already dead and replaced by local warlords using his name. High command oscillated between denial and obsession. More troops were sent. More resources were drained. What had begun as a manhunt had become a strategic hemorrhage, tying down forces desperately needed elsewhere in the war. The American understood time better than his enemies. He never rushed. Every engagement served a purpose: to capture supplies, to gather information, or to force a reaction. When the Japanese surged into one region, resistance vanished there and erupted somewhere else. The jungle became a chessboard where every Japanese move exposed another weakness. The enemy was always reacting, never deciding. By the third year, the reality was impossible to hide. Japanese soldiers spoke openly of an invisible army. Officers requested transfers rather than lead jungle operations. Maps were redrawn not by terrain but by fear. Entire valleys were avoided, not because they were impassable, but because those who entered rarely returned. The American had achieved what generals with divisions could not. He had made the enemy doubt the war itself. And still he remained unseen. No speeches, no declarations, no symbols to rally around, only results. 35,000 men and women moving as one without ever assembling, striking without revealing their size, surviving without conventional supply lines. It was warfare stripped to its most primal form: patience, intelligence, and willpower fused into a machine that could not be bombed into submission. The Japanese high command finally reached a terrifying conclusion. Even if they killed the American tomorrow, it would change nothing. The structure he built no longer required him. The idea had already spread too far, sunk too deep into the jungle and the people who lived there. The hunter had become irrelevant. The hunted had multiplied, and that was when the war itself began to turn. By the time Allied command began to hear whispers of what was happening inside the jungle, the reports sounded unbelievable. Entire Japanese battalions pinned down without major engagements, supply lines collapsing without clear cause, air reconnaissance showing nothing but endless green, while ground units reported coordinated resistance that vanished before it could be measured. To planners sitting behind maps and radios, it felt like fantasy. To the soldiers trapped in the canopy, it felt like suffocation. The American had anticipated this moment. He knew that invisibility could not last forever. Growth brings noise. Noise attracts attention, so he reshaped the force again, dividing it into layers. The outer layer harassed and distracted. The inner layer trained and expanded. At the core were units that never fought at all. Intelligence collectors, messengers, logisticians who ensured that food, medicine, and information moved without detection. The army was no longer just fighters. It was an ecosystem. Communication became the weapon that truly changed the war. Scouts learned to listen more than they spoke. They mapped enemy routines, moods, and weaknesses. They knew which officers were reckless, which units were exhausted, which convoys carried food instead of ammunition. Every Japanese mistake was recorded, remembered, and exploited. Attacks were no longer reactions. They were predictions fulfilled. The psychological toll on the Japanese forces deepened. Soldiers slept in short, terrified bursts. Rifles were kept loaded at all times. The sound of a snapping twig could freeze an entire platoon. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some claimed the American could walk through the jungle without touching the ground. Others believed he commanded spirits. These myths were not discouraged. They were allowed to grow, because fear, once planted, requires no further effort as Allied pressure increased elsewhere in the Pacific. The Japanese High Command faced a cruel dilemma. Pull troops out of the jungle and risk the secret army spilling into open territory, or keep bleeding resources into a war they could not see. They chose the second option, and the jungle drank deeply. Every month spent chasing ghosts weakened Japan's ability to resist conventional assaults elsewhere. The American never needed to win decisively. He only needed to delay. Inside the resistance, loyalty shifted from the man to the mission. Fighters spoke less of the American himself and more of the rules he had left behind. His presence became symbolic rather than physical. Some recruits had never seen him, yet followed orders attributed to him without question. This was the final transformation, the creation of a force that no longer required its founder to stand at the center. Operations expanded. Coordinated strikes disabled infrastructure. Bridges collapsed at precisely the wrong moment. Depots burned without warning. Japanese units moved constantly, exhausting themselves against an enemy that chose when and where to exist. Every action was designed to avoid spectacle and maximize confusion. There were no heroic charges, no last stands, only erosion. The jungle, once a prison, became a shield. What had been isolation turned into advantage. The American had turned scarcity into discipline and chaos into order. 35,000 lives now moved according to a rhythm the enemy could not hear. Even when Japanese units claimed victories, they were hollow. Territory meant nothing if it could not be held without fear. As the war approached its later stages, the truth became undeniable. This hidden army had altered the balance without ever appearing on a map. It had forced strategic decisions far beyond its size. It had drained manpower, shattered morale, and rewritten what resistance could look like in modern warfare. The hunted man had become irrelevant. The system he created was the weapon. And somewhere deep in the jungle, as the tide of the war finally shifted, the American prepared for the final phase, not of conquest, but of revelation. The moment revelation approached, it did not arrive with trumpets or banners. It came quietly, as everything in this war had come. Allied aircraft began landing on makeshift strips, carved from jungle clearings that should not have existed. Supply drops landed in zones already secured, guarded by men who were not listed on any roster. When Allied officers stepped onto the ground expecting chaos, they found order. Disciplined formations emerging from the trees, faces hardened by years of invisible war. For the first time, the outside world saw proof that the jungle had been occupied long before they arrived. The American did not step forward as a conqueror. He remained deliberately in the background, letting others speak, letting the structure speak for itself. Allied commanders struggled to understand what they were seeing. 35,000 fighters, trained, fed, organized, and loyal, not through pay or coercion, but through trust. This was not a militia that could be disbanded with a speech. It was a force forged by shared survival. And it demanded respect rather than recognition. Coordination with Allied forces changed the tempo of the campaign overnight. Japanese units that had survived, years of jungle warfare now faced pressure from both sides, conventional, assaults pushing inward, and the hidden army collapsing resistance from within. Escape routes vanished. Intelligence leaks multiplied. For Japanese commanders, the war no longer had a clear front. Every direction felt hostile. Every movement felt exposed. The resistance fighters adapted once more, shifting from sabotage to containment. They guided Allied units through terrain once considered impassable. They marked safe paths, identified traps, and isolated enemy pockets with surgical precision. What had taken Japanese forces months to attempt now took days. The psychological reversal was complete. Those who had hunted for years were now being systematically cornered by an enemy that knew their habits better than they knew themselves. Yet victory brought its own danger. The American understood that exposure could unravel everything. Discipline was enforced harder than ever. Fighters were reminded that their strength lay not in numbers, but in restraint. There would be no reprisals, no celebrations at the expense of civilians, no settling of old scores. The war had been survived by control. It would be ended the same way. As Japanese resistance collapsed, surrender came unevenly. Some units laid down arms the moment they realized escape was impossible. Others fought desperately, driven by fear of the unseen enemy that had haunted them for years. In those final clashes, the jungle bore witness to the full cost of obsession. Lives spent chasing a man who had already won by refusing to be found. When the fighting finally ebbed, Allied officers attempted to record what had happened. Reports were written, then rewritten. Numbers were questioned, timelines disputed. The idea that one American, isolated and hunted, had built a force capable of shaping an entire theater of war-strained credibility. Much of it was classified. Some of it was quietly forgotten. History prefers clean narratives, and this story was anything but clean. The American declined medals and ceremonies. He understood something few victors ever do. Recognition freezes a moment, but survival requires movement. He focused instead on disbandment, reintegration, and protection for those who had followed him into the shadows. The army that had never existed on paper would not exist in peace either. It would dissolve back into villages, fields, and forests, leaving behind only the consequences of its actions. What remained was a lesson written not in monuments but in absence. The absence of Japanese divisions that could have fought elsewhere. The absence of casualties that never occurred because battles were avoided. The absence of a man who had been hunted for 3 years, only to step away when the hunt no longer mattered. And in that silence, the jungle returned to green, holding secrets it would never fully give back. The months that followed the collapse of Japanese control, an uncomfortable quiet settled over the region. War had trained everyone to listen for danger, and now the absence of it felt unnatural. Allied administrators arrived with clipboards and orders, trying to convert something organic and invisible into lines of authority they could understand. They struggled. The resistance did not fit into categories. There were no clear ranks, no payrolls, no official enlistment dates. Men who had led hundreds returned to farming without ceremony. Fighters who had shaped battles disappeared into villages as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The American watched this process carefully. He understood that the greatest threat now was not an enemy army, but memory. Loose stories could become myths. Myths could become politics. Politics could turn survival into exploitation. He worked quietly with Allied officers to keep details vague. Numbers blurred, timelines softened, not to protect himself, but to protect the people who had trusted him when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose. Many of the fighters struggled to adjust. Years of moving silently, of living without certainty, had reshaped their instincts. Peace felt fragile, temporary, undeserved. Some expected punishment, others feared abandonment. The American addressed this not with speeches, but with structure, helping establish local defense units, agricultural cooperatives, and trade networks. The same principles that had sustained an army were now redirected toward rebuilding lives. Discipline became stability. Coordination became commerce. Japanese prisoners, when questioned, revealed the depth of psychological damage left behind. Officers admitted they had exaggerated reports just to justify failure. Soldiers described an enemy that never appeared yet was everywhere. Some confessed they had fired blindly into the jungle simply to feel less helpless. The realization that they had been fighting a system rather than a man haunted many long after the war ended. It was easier to hate a face than an idea, and they had never been given a face. Allied historians attempted to document the phenomenon, but the story resisted capture. There were no decisive battles to highlight, no singular turning point to celebrate. Just erosion, pressure, time weaponized. In an era obsessed with firepower and scale, the notion that patience and organization could paralyze tens of thousands of troops felt almost subversive. Files were archived. Footnotes replaced chapters. The story faded from official narratives, surviving mainly in fragments and testimonies. The American himself prepared to leave. He did not announce it. He did not gather those who had followed him. He understood that goodbyes create dependency. Instead, he ensured that systems would function without him, just as they had learned to function even when his presence was uncertain. On a quiet morning, he stepped away from the jungle that had both hunted and protected him, leaving behind no marker of where leadership had once stood. Those who noticed his absence felt it immediately, then less and less with time. That was the point. Leadership that cannot be removed becomes tyranny. Leadership that teaches replacement becomes legacy. The hidden army, once feared and powerful, dissolved completely, not because it was defeated, but because it had succeeded. Yet the impact lingered. Long after the war, military thinkers quietly studied what had happened. Not publicly, not officially. They looked at how information moved without technology, how loyalty was built without ideology, how restraint proved more destructive than aggression. They found no manual, no doctrine, only principles that resisted simplification. What happened in that jungle could not be easily repeated, and that made it unsettling. The world moved on, as it always does. New wars demanded louder stories, bigger explosions, clear villains. But somewhere beneath those narratives remained a truth few were comfortable admitting. That one hunted man, by refusing to fight the war he was given, had changed the outcome of one he could never officially claim. When historians eventually closed the files and the jungle reclaimed its scars, the war moved on without ever fully explaining what had happened there. No parade marched in his name. No statue marked the place where strategy had defeated force. The man who had once been worth 50,000 lives to capture simply returned to anonymity, as if the war had passed over him rather than through him. That disappearance was not a failure of recognition. It was the final act of the strategy itself. Because the truth was too unsettling to sit comfortably in textbooks, it meant admitting that overwhelming power can be neutralized without matching it. That fear, when mishandled, multiplies resistance rather than obedience. That an empire armed with aircraft, artillery, and endless manpower had been stalled, not by superior weapons, but by patience, discipline, and the quiet consent of ordinary people. It meant acknowledging that the most dangerous armies are not always the ones you can see. The jungle never belonged to flags or empires. It belonged to those who understood it, respected it, and listened to it. The American had not conquered it. He had aligned with it. He did not bend people to his will. He gave them a reason to choose his side. In doing so, he created something far more powerful than an army, a shared purpose that survived his absence. For 3 years, the Japanese hunted a man. What they never fully understood was that the hunt itself was the weapon used against them. Every troop deployed, every patrol lost, every night spent fearing shadows weakened them far more than a decisive battle ever could. By the time they realized the truth, that killing the man would not kill the movement, the war had already slipped beyond their control. And when peace finally arrived, the hidden army did the most extraordinary thing of all. It vanished. No rebellion, no power grab, no demand for reward. The fighters returned to fields, rivers, and villages, carrying memories no one would ask them to explain. The absence of chaos was the final proof of success. Armies that exist for power cling to it. Armies that exist for survival let it go. Somewhere, long after the jungle fell silent, the idea remained, passed quietly between those who understood what had happened. That wars are not only fought with bullets, that leadership is proven by what functions without you, and that sometimes the most decisive victories leave behind no monuments at all. The world remembers battles because they are loud. It forgets patience because it is quiet. But in that forgotten green expanse, where 50,000 hunted one and failed, history learned a lesson it would spend decades trying not to repeat.